On September 8th, 2024, at 6:40 in the morning, Virgil Kemp unlocked the bay doors of Kemp's Repair on Route 9, 2 miles east of Gibson City, Illinois, the same way he had every working day since November 14th, 1977. He pulled the chain on the overhead door. He flipped the breaker for the shop lights, 4 fluorescent fixtures, 2 of which he'd replaced himself in 2003 and 2016. He started the coffee in a drip machine on the workbench that he'd owned since 1991. He set his thermos beside it. He walked to the first bay and looked at the tractor waiting for him. It was a 1972 John Deere 432, owned by a farmer from Paxton named Lloyd Myers. The 432 had 16,411 hours on it. The engine, a 404 cubic inch naturally aspirated inline 6 producing 115 horsepower, had developed a knock at 16,380 hours. Lloyd had driven it to Virgil's shop on September 2nd. Virgil had listened to the engine for 90 seconds and told Lloyd it was a rod bearing. He said, "Number 4 cylinder, I can hear it." Lloyd said, "Can you fix it?" Virgil said, "I've rebuilt this engine before. I rebuilt it in 2009 at 11,200 hours. I can do it again." Lloyd said, "How much?" Virgil said, $3,800 for parts and labor. That includes a full bearing set, new rod bolts, gaskets, fluids, and 22 hours of labor at $65 an hour. Lloyd said, "Lanning quoted me $9,400 and a 3-week wait." Virgil said, "I'll have it done in 6 days." Virgil started the teardown on September 3rd. He pulled the hood, the rocker cover, the intake manifold, the exhaust manifold, and the head in the first 4 hours. He worked methodically, each bolt in sequence, each part laid on the bench in the order it came off, each gasket surface cleaned with a razor blade and solvent. He'd done this procedure on 4 320 engines 23 times in 47 years. He didn't need a manual. The manual was in his hands. By September 5th, he had the oil pan off and the crankshaft exposed. The number 4 rod bearing was scored, a deep groove running the full width of the bearing surface, caused by oil starvation from a partially blocked oil gallery. Virgil cleaned the gallery with a rifle brush and compressed air. He measured the crankshaft journal with a micrometer, 2.7489 inches. The factory specification was 2.7490 to 2.7500. The journal was at the bottom of the tolerance range, but still within specification. He wouldn't need to have the crank turned. That saved Lloyd $450. On the morning of September 8th, the parts had arrived. A full bearing set from Reliance Power Parts, $340. New rod bolts, $96 for 8. Head gasket set, $285. Oil pump, $220. Virgil replaced it as preventive maintenance because the original pump had 16,411 hours on it and the gears were showing wear. Total parts cost $1,247. Virgil's labor for the full rebuild would be 22 hours at $65 per hour, $1,430. Shop supplies, fluids, and filters, $180. Total job, $2,857. Not the $3,800 he'd quoted Lloyd. Virgil had quoted high because he expected the crankshaft might need turning. It didn't. so the bill went down. That's how Virgil worked. He quoted the worst case. He charged the actual case. Earl Braddock pulled into Virgil's shop at 7:15 a.m. on September 8th. He wasn't there for a repair. He was there because Ruth had told him something the night before that he couldn't get out of his head. Ruth had been at the Gibson City post office on September 6th. She'd run into Helen Kemp, Virgil's wife. Helen had mentioned casually while sorting her mail that Virgil had been having pain in his right hand for the past 4 months. Stiffness in the mornings, numbness in the fingers by afternoon. He'd seen a doctor in Bloomington on August 14th. The diagnosis was advanced osteoarthritis in the right hand, complicated by 47 years of repetitive motion, wrenching, torquing, gripping, pulling. The doctor had recommended Virgil reduce his workload. He'd mentioned the possibility of surgery, a joint fusion in the index finger that would eliminate the pain, but also eliminate 40% of the finger's range of motion. Virgil had told the doctor he'd think about it. He hadn't told anyone else, not Earl, not any of his customers, not anyone except Helen. Earl walked into the shop and found Virgil fitting the new bearings into the 432O's connecting rods. Virgil's right hand was wrapped in a compression glove, gray, the kind sold at pharmacies for arthritis. Earl had never seen Virgil wear a glove. In 30 years, he'd never seen anything on Virgil's hands except oil and calluses. Earl said, "Morning." Virgil said, "Morning." Earl looked at the glove. He didn't ask about it. He said, "How's the 432O coming?" Virgil said, "Bearing's going in today. I'll have it running by Wednesday." Earl said, "Ruth, talk to Helen." Virgil stopped what he was doing. He set the connecting rod on the bench. He said, "Helen talks too much." Earl said, "Helen's worried." Virgil said, "Helen's always worried." Earl said, "Virgil, how bad is it?" Virgil held up his right hand. He tried to make a fist. The fingers closed about 70% of the way. The index finger stopped at about 60%. He said, "It's arthritis. I've got 47 years of torque in these hands. The doctor said I should slow down." Earl said, "Are you going to?" Virgil said, "I'm going to finish Lloyd's engine." If this kind of story matters to you, the kind where a man's hands tell the story of his life's work, we'd be honored if you subscribed. This channel exists because the people who keep farm equipment running are the most overlooked part of agriculture. We tell these stories slow because that's how the work was done. Earl sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and watched Virgil work. He'd watched Virgil work hundreds of times over 30 years. He knew the rhythm, the way Virgil picked up a wrench without looking, the way he torqued a bolt by feel before checking it with the torque wrench, the way he laid parts on the bench in perfect order so the reassembly was the teardown in reverse. But this time, Earl noticed something he hadn't before. Virgil's right hand shook slightly when he gripped the torque wrench. Not a lot, just a tremor, barely visible, when he applied pressure. And after each torque sequence, Virgil set the wrench down and flexed his fingers, opening and closing his hand 3 or 4 times before picking the wrench up again. Earl said, "How many engines have you rebuilt in this shop?" Virgil said, "I don't keep count." Earl said, "Guess." Virgil thought about it. He said, "Full rebuilds, pulling the engine, tearing it down to the bare block, replacing bearings, rings, gaskets, the whole job. Probably 340, maybe 350. Earl said, "All John Deere?" Virgil said, "Mostly. I've done some IH, some Case, a few Fords in the early years, but 80% John Deere. That's what this county runs. Earl said, "What was the first one?" Virgil said, "A 1966 John Deere 4020 diesel. December 1977. My first month in business. A farmer named Gene Albrecht brought it in with a cracked head and a blown head gasket. I charged him $800 for the whole job. Took me 5 days because I didn't have the right puller for the injectors and had to drive to Champaign to borrow one." Earl said, "You remember the price from 1977? Virgil said, "I remember every first. First engine, first transmission, first hydraulic rebuild, first time a farmer cried in my shop because he couldn't afford the repair, and I did it anyway and told him to pay me when the crop came in." Earl said, "How many times did that happen?" Virgil said, "More than you'd think, less than you'd hope." Nathan Braddock came by the shop at noon. He brought lunch, 2 sandwiches from the Casey's in Gibson City, and a bag of chips. He handed one sandwich to Virgil and one to Earl. Nathan had been coming to Virgil's shop since he was 6 years old. He'd sat on the same 5-gallon bucket his father was sitting on now and watched Virgil work on Walter Braddock's 4440. Nathan said, "What's the glove for?" Virgil said, "Arthritis." Nathan said, "Since when?" Virgil said, "Since about 35,000 bolts ago." Nathan didn't laugh. He looked at Virgil's hand. He said, "What did the doctor say?" Virgil said, "He said I should retire." Nathan said, "Are you going to?" Virgil said the same thing he'd said to Earl. "I'm going to finish Lloyd's engine." Earl and Nathan exchanged a look. Earl said, "Virgil, what happens to this shop when you're done?" Virgil set his sandwich on the bench. He said, "I've been thinking about that. Helen and I talked about it in August, after the doctor visit. I don't have a son in the business. I don't have an apprentice. I've had 3 kids come through here over the years wanting to learn. 2 of them lasted a summer, 1 lasted 8 months. None of them had the patience for it. This work takes patience. It takes 10 years before you can diagnose an engine by ear. It takes 15 before a farmer trusts you with his livelihood. I've been doing it for 47. When I stop, the shop closes. That's just what happens." Earl said, "What about the equipment? The tools?" Virgil said, "I've got $120,000 in tools and diagnostic equipment in this shop. The Snap-on box alone is worth $18,000. The engine hoist, the press, the lathe, another $35,000. If I sell it at auction, I'll get 40 cents on the dollar, maybe less. Most of this stuff is specialized. Farm mechanic tools don't sell the way farm equipment does." Earl said, "And the building?" Virgil said, "I own it. Helen and I bought the lot in 1976, built the first bay in 1977, added the second bay in 1984 for $22,000. The roof was replaced in 2008 for $14,500. It's worth maybe $85,000 as a commercial property. But out here on Route 9, there's not a lot of buyers for a 2-bay shop." Dale Voss came by at 2 p.m. He didn't have a repair. He never brought his equipment to Virgil. He took his machines to Lanning Implement because, as he told anyone who'd listen, "I prefer to use the authorized dealer." The real reason was that Virgil had told Dale in 2011 that his 7R's hydraulic problem was caused by running the wrong fluid. Dale had used a $12 per gallon generic instead of the $22 per gallon high guard that John Deere specifies. Dale had been embarrassed and had never come back. He stopped by the shop now because he'd heard about the arthritis from someone at the Farm Bureau breakfast. He said, "I hear you're hanging it up, Virgil." Virgil said, "I haven't said that." Dale said, "Well, the word around town is you're done." Virgil said, "The word around town comes from people who don't work in this shop." Dale said, "I'm just saying if you're selling tools, I might be interested in that Snap-on box." Earl, that's still sitting on the bucket, said, "Dale, the man's hands aren't cold yet." Dale looked at Earl. He looked at Virgil. He said, "Just making conversation." He left. Virgil watched him drive away in the white Yukon and said, "That man's been trying to buy my Snap-on box since 2015. If you're still here, subscribe. We don't rush these stories because the people in them didn't rush the work." Virgil finished the 4320 rebuild on September 11th, 6 days as promised. He installed the new bearings, new rod bolts, new oil pump, new gaskets. He torqued the head bolts in 3 stages, 50 foot-pounds, then 80, then 110, in the sequence specified in the John Deere technical manual, a sequence he'd memorized in 1978 and hadn't needed to look up since. He set the valve lash at .020 intake, .025 exhaust. He primed the oil system with a drill-driven pump until the gauge showed 45 pounds per square inch. He filled the cooling system with a 50-50 mix, 6.5 gallons. He added 10 quarts of 15 W40 diesel oil. He started the engine at 3:17 p.m. It caught on the second crank. No knock, no smoke. Oil pressure at 55 pounds per square inch at idle, 65 pounds per square inch at 1,800 revolutions per minute. Coolant temperature stabilized at 185 degrees after 12 minutes. Virgil let it idle for 30 minutes, checking for leaks at every gasket surface. There were none. He revved it to 2,200 revolutions per minute and held it there for 5 minutes. The engine ran smooth and even, the sound of a 6-cylinder diesel with new bearings and correct tolerances, a sound Virgil had heard 340 times and never tired of. Lloyd Myers picked up the tractor on September 13th. Virgil handed him the invoice, $2,857. Lloyd looked at it and said, "You quoted me $3,800. Virgil said, "The crank didn't need turning. I'm not charging you for work I didn't do." Lloyd said, "Lanning would have." Virgil said, "I'm not Lanning." Lloyd wrote a check for $2,857 and shook Virgil's hand, carefully, because he'd noticed the compression glove too. Lloyd said, "How much longer are you going to do this?" Virgil said, "As long as my hands let me." Lloyd said, "You've been saying that for 47 years. Virgil said, "And it's been true every time." Lloyd drove the 4320 home that afternoon. He called Virgil the next morning and said, "It runs better than it did in 2009 after the last rebuild. Whatever you did to the oil pump made a difference. The pressure is rock solid." Virgil said, "The old pump had worn gears. It was only making 38 pounds per square inch at idle. The new one makes 55. That's the difference between adequate lubrication and correct lubrication." Lloyd said, "Lanning wouldn't have caught that." Virgil said, "Lanning would have replaced the engine." Lloyd said, "For $9,400. Virgil said, "For $9,400. That evening, Helen Kemp asked Virgil how his hand felt. He said, "It hurts." She said, "Worse than yesterday?" He said, "About the same." She said, "The doctor said the surgery has a 90% success rate for pain relief." Virgil said, "He also said 6 weeks of recovery, no wrenching for 6 weeks." Helen said, "6 weeks isn't forever." Virgil said, "In planting season, it is. I've got 11 tractors scheduled for spring service between March and May. If I'm down for 6 weeks, those farmers go to landing. Some of them won't come back." Helen didn't say anything else. She knew the math. Virgil's loyalty to his customers was the same as his customers' loyalty to him. Earned one job at a time, over 47 years, and not something you risk for 6 weeks of convenience. Earl came back to the shop on September 14th. He brought a proposal. He'd talked to Nathan about it. He'd talked to Ruth. He'd talked to Keith Oberlin and Jim Schaefer and Ray Kellner, the same farmers who'd stood in Virgil's driveway 6 months earlier over the cease and desist letter. The proposal was this. The farmers would collectively fund an apprenticeship position at Kemp's Repair. They would find a candidate, someone young, mechanically inclined, willing to learn, and pay half their salary for 2 years while Virgil trained them. The other half would come from Virgil's shop revenue. After 2 years, the apprentice would either buy into the business or take over the lease on the building. The farmer's investment would be approximately $4,200 each across 8 farms, $33,600 total, to ensure that Ford County had an independent John Deere mechanic for the next generation. Virgil listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. He sat on his rolling stool with his coffee thermos and his compression glove and his 47 years of engine oil under his fingernails. When Earl finished, Virgil said, "You planned all this?" Earl said, "Ruth planned most of it. I just made the calls." Virgil said, "And the farmers agreed?" Earl said, "Every one of them. Keith said he'd rather invest $4,200 in your shop than spend $11,000 a year at Lanning." Virgil said, "What if the kid doesn't work out?" Earl said, "Then we find another one. The shop doesn't close, Virgil. That's the point." Virgil was quiet for a long time. He looked at his hands. The right one in the compression glove, the left one bare, both stained with 47 years of oil that no soap could fully remove. He said, "My father came home from Korea in 1953 with shrapnel in his left knee. He walked with a limp the rest of his life. He never once complained about it. He said the knee was the price of the work, and the work was worth the price." Virgil held up his right hand. "These hands are the price of my work, and the work was worth the price." He looked at Earl. "Tell the farmers I accept, and tell Ruth I said thank you for the math." Earl posted a notice at the Ford County Co-op the following week. It read, "Apprentice mechanic wanted. Kemp's Repair, Route 9, Gibson City. Must be willing to work, willing to learn, and willing to stay. Apply in person. Bring your own tools." 11 people applied. Virgil interviewed all of them over 3 weeks. In his shop, while he worked, he asked each one the same question. "What's the first thing you do when a farmer drives a tractor into your shop?" 10 of them said some version of run a diagnostic. One of them, a 23-year-old named Tyler Grimes from Anchor, who'd been working at a Caterpillar dealer in Peoria for 2 years, said, "Listen to it. You listen to the engine before you plug anything in." Virgil hired him on the spot. He called Earl that evening and said, "I found one." Earl said, "What's his name?" Virgil said, Tyler Grimes, 23, anchor kid, worked at a cat dealer in Peoria for 2 years. Earl said, "Why'd he leave?" Virgil said he was tired of being told to replace whole assemblies when the problem was a $14 seal. He wants to fix things, not swap parts. Earl said, "Sounds like somebody I know." Virgil said, "Don't start." Ruth drove to the shop on October 10th with the financial paperwork. She'd built a partnership agreement. 2 pages, plain language, no legal jargon. The 8 participating farmers would each contribute $4,200 over 24 months, paid quarterly in installments of $525. The funds would cover Tyler's salary supplement of $2,800 per month for the first year, stepping down to $1,400 per month in the second year as the shop's revenue absorbed the cost. Ruth had projected Virgil's shop revenue based on the last 3 years of invoices. $87,000 in 2022, $94,000 in 2023, $91,000 in 2024 through September. She'd estimated that an apprentice would increase capacity by approximately 30% within 18 months, bringing annual revenue to approximately $118,000. Virgil looked at the numbers and said, "Ruth, you should have been an accountant." Ruth said, "I was a 4th grade teacher. We're better with budgets than accountants are." Virgil signed the agreement at his workbench with a blue ballpoint pen while his coffee got cold. Tyler started on October 14th, 2024. His first job was handing Virgil wrenches during an injector replacement on a 2018 John Deere 6155R. Virgil made him identify each wrench by size before handing it over. 10 millimeters, 13 millimeters, 15 millimeters, 17 millimeters, 19 millimeters. Tyler got them all right. Virgil said, "Good. Tomorrow you'll hand me sockets. The day after that, you'll pull a valve cover. In 6 months, you'll do your first solar oil change. In a year, you'll do your first diagnostic. In 2 years, I'll trust you with an engine rebuild, not before." Tyler said, "2 years?" Virgil said, "I waited 10 years before I trusted myself with one. I'm giving you the shortcut." By December, Tyler had completed 14 supervised oil changes, 8 filter replacements, 3 valve cover removals, and 2 hydraulic hose replacements, all under Virgil's direct observation. Virgil graded every job on a clipboard he kept on the workbench. Time to completion, torque accuracy, cleanliness of the work area, and whether the customer's tractor left the shop in better condition than it arrived. Tyler's average score after 2 months was 87 out of 100. Virgil told Earl, "He's not me yet, but he listens, and he doesn't cut corners. That's 90% of the job." Keith Oberlin brought his 8R310 in for a hydraulic diagnostic on November 18th. It was the first job Tyler performed with Virgil, watching from a stool instead of standing over him. Tyler connected the diagnostic tool, read the fault code, a pressure sensor intermittent, and traced it to a corroded connector pin on the rear remote valve. He cleaned the pin with contact cleaner, applied dielectric grease, cleared the code, and tested the system through 3 full cycles. Total time, 52 minutes. Virgil would have done it in 35, but the fix was correct, the work was clean, and the tractor left the shop running right. Keith paid $85. He told Earl at the co-op the next morning, "The kid's good. He's not Virgil yet, but he's good." Earl said, "Give him time." The 4320 that Virgil rebuilt in September was his 341st full-engine rebuild. Whether it was his last depends on his hands. The doctor in Bloomington wants to see him again in March 2025. The surgery is still on the table. Virgil hasn't decided. Helen wants him to have it. Earl wants him to have it. Virgil says he'll decide after he sees how Tyler handles his first winter in the shop. If the kid can change a set of injectors in January with cold hands and bad light, Virgil told Earl, then maybe I can afford to fix mine. The compression glove is still on his right hand. The coffee thermos is still on the workbench. The shop lights still come on at 6:40 every morning. And for now, that's enough.